The morning light had barely broken through the windows of the White House when President Donald Trump's fingers began moving across his Truth Social account. It was just after midnight on a Monday in March 2025, and the silence of the early hours would soon be shattered by a declaration that would send shockwaves through the political establishment. Trump typed furiously, his words carrying the weight of constitutional controversy. The pardons that former President Joe Biden had issued to the January 6th committee members, he declared, were now void, vacant, and of no further force or effect. The reason, according to Trump, was simple yet explosive. Biden had used an auto pen to sign them, meaning he never physically put pen to paper. The implications were staggering. 9 members of the January 6th committee, including former Republican Representatives Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, had received preemptive pardons from Biden in his final hours in office. Dr. Anthony Fauci and former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley were also protected by these last-minute pardons. All of these individuals had faced intense criticism from Trump throughout his first term. But Trump's post went further than just questioning the method of signing. He suggested something far more sinister. Biden, Trump claimed, did not know anything about them. The former president, according to Trump, was so cognitively impaired that his staff may have signed documents on his behalf without his knowledge or consent. If true, Trump suggested, this could constitute criminal behavior. The auto pen controversy wasn't new. The Heritage Foundation had posted on social media weeks earlier, claiming that whoever controlled the auto pen controlled the presidency. This conspiracy theory had been simmering in conservative circles, but Trump's declaration gave it presidential authority. As dawn broke over Washington, reporters began frantically checking their phones. News desks across the country buzzed with activity. The implications were massive. Could a sitting president simply declare his predecessor's pardons invalid? Did Trump have the constitutional authority to make such a claim? And most importantly, was there any truth to the suggestion that Biden had been unaware of what he was signing? The White House staff arrived to find themselves in the middle of a constitutional crisis. Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, at just 27 years old, the youngest person ever to hold the position, knew she would face a barrage of questions. The press briefing room, always a battleground between journalists and the administration, was about to become the center of a heated confrontation. CNN's Caitlin Collins, the network's chief White House correspondent and primetime anchor, was among the first to grasp the significance of Trump's claims. She understood that this wasn't just another Trump social media outburst. This was an attack on the very foundations of presidential power and the constitutional process of pardons. As the morning progressed, legal experts began weighing in. Constitutional scholars scrambled to research precedents. The question everyone was asking was simple, yet profound. Did the method of signing affect the validity of a presidential pardon? More importantly, could one president simply declare another president's actions void? The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just the relationship between the press and the presidency, but the very understanding of how presidential power works in America. Leavitt knew that when she stepped into that briefing room, she would be defending not just Trump's claims, but the administration's credibility on one of the most fundamental aspects of presidential authority. The reporters gathering in the White House press room that morning had no idea they were about to witness one of the most memorable exchanges in recent political history. The tension was building, and everyone could feel it. The constitutional storm that Trump had unleashed with his midnight post was about to meet the immovable force of an aggressive press corps demanding answers. Collins checked her notes one final time, preparing the questions that would soon put Leavitt in an impossible position. The CNN reporter knew she had the administration cornered on a claim that seemed to fly in the face of constitutional law. What she didn't expect was how forcefully Leavitt would fight back, turning the tables on the press in a way that would define their relationship for months to come. The White House press briefing room hummed with anticipation as reporters filed in for what they knew would be a contentious Monday afternoon session. The elegant blue backdrop and presidential podium stood ready for another battle in the ongoing war between the Trump administration and the media. Karoline Leavitt's heels clicked against the floor as she approached the lectern, her expression betraying none of the pressure she undoubtedly felt. The youngest press secretary in American history had already proven herself to be a formidable defender of the Trump administration. Her quick wit and willingness to engage in verbal sparring matches with reporters had earned her both admirers and critics. Today, however, she faced a challenge unlike any other. How do you defend a claim that constitutional experts were already calling legally dubious at best? Caitlin Collins sat in the front row, her notebook filled with carefully prepared questions. The CNN correspondent had covered the Trump administration extensively and knew exactly how to press for answers. She understood that Leavitt's response to Trump's pardons claim would either provide constitutional justification or reveal the administration's vulnerability on a major legal issue. As Leavitt began the briefing with routine announcements, the tension in the room was palpable. Every reporter present knew that the real fireworks would begin when someone asked about Trump's overnight Truth Social post. The question wasn't if someone would bring it up, but who would strike first and how. Leavitt would respond. Collins raised her hand, and Leavitt recognized her with a slight nod. The CNN reporter's voice was steady and professional as she posed her question, but the words carried the weight of constitutional law behind them. She asked directly whether attorneys at the White House had told President Trump that he possessed the legal authority to simply undo a pardon because it was signed with an auto pen. The question was brilliant in its simplicity. It cut straight to the heart of Trump's claim, while forcing Leavitt to either produce legal justification or admit the administration was operating without proper constitutional authority. Collins had essentially cornered the press secretary, demanding evidence for an extraordinary claim that appeared to have no basis in law. Leavitt's response was immediate and telling. Rather than providing legal justification or citing constitutional precedent, she pivoted to what she called Trump's real point. The president, she claimed, was simply begging the question that journalists should be investigating. It was a masterful deflection, but Collins wasn't about to let her off the hook that easily. The press secretary continued, framing Trump's claim as legitimate inquiry into Biden's cognitive state during his final days in office. She suggested that the real question wasn't about presidential authority to void pardons, but whether Biden had been aware of what he was signing. The cognitive impairment angle had been a consistent Trump talking point, and Leavitt was using it to shift the conversation away from constitutional law. But Collins pressed harder, recognizing the deflection for what it was. She asked the follow-up question that would define the entire exchange. Was there any evidence supporting Trump's claim that Biden was unaware of the pardons he had signed? It was a straightforward request for proof to back up an extraordinary allegation. The briefing room fell silent as Leavitt processed the question. Every reporter present understood the significance of this moment. If the administration had evidence that Biden's staff had acted without his knowledge, it would be a massive scandal. If they didn't have evidence, they were essentially making unfounded accusations against a former president. The cameras rolled as Leavitt prepared her response, unaware that her next words would become a defining moment of the Trump presidency's relationship with the media. The press secretary was about to deliver a line that would be replayed countless times, analyzed by political commentators, and remembered as one of the most memorable exchanges in White House press briefing history. In that moment, Leavitt made a decision that would reveal her approach to handling an aggressive press corps. Rather than providing evidence or admitting the administration lacked proof, she was about to turn the tables on the reporter in a way that would shock the room and redefine the dynamic between the White House and CNN. The tension reached its peak as Collins waited for an answer, her pen poised over her notebook. She had no idea that her simple request for evidence was about to result in a response that would make headlines across the country and establish Leavitt as one of the most confrontational press secretaries in recent memory. The words that came out of Karoline Leavitt's mouth would echo through the halls of the White House and across news networks for days to come. Looking directly at Caitlin Collins with a tone that was both dismissive and challenging, Leavitt delivered her now famous response. "You're a reporter. You should find out." The briefing room erupted in a mixture of gasps, nervous laughter, and stunned silence. In 5 simple words, the press secretary had completely reversed the dynamic of the exchange. Instead of providing evidence for the administration's claims, she had essentially told one of the country's most prominent journalists to do her own homework. Collins sat momentarily speechless, her pen frozen above her notebook. In her years of covering politics, she had experienced hostile responses from press secretaries, but never had one so boldly suggested that providing evidence wasn't the administration's responsibility. The audacity of the response was breathtaking, even by Trump administration standards. Leavitt wasn't finished. She continued her response, doubling down on the cognitive impairment narrative while simultaneously shifting responsibility to the press corps. She suggested that Trump was raising legitimate questions about whether Biden had been aware of the pardons he was signing and whether his staff might have acted without his consent or knowledge. The press secretary's strategy became clear. Rather than defending the constitutional authority for Trump's claim, she was reframing the entire discussion. The issue, according to Leavitt, wasn't whether Trump could void Biden's pardons, but whether those pardons were legitimate in the first place. It was a brilliant rhetorical maneuver that put the press on the defensive. She referenced the New York Post's reporting that even some Biden administration officials had wondered whether the former president was fully aware of what he was signing. This gave her claim a veneer of credibility, suggesting that concerns about Biden's cognitive state weren't just partisan attacks, but legitimate questions raised by his own staff. Leavitt then escalated the stakes dramatically. She suggested that if staff members had indeed signed documents on Biden's behalf without his knowledge, it could constitute criminal behavior. The implication was staggering. She was essentially accusing the former president's staff of potentially committing fraud while questioning the legitimacy of constitutional actions taken by a sitting president. The other reporters in the room watched the exchange with fascination and horror. They were witnessing a masterclass in press secretary combat, but also a fundamental breakdown in the traditional relationship between the White House and the media. Leavitt was operating by entirely different rules, refusing to accept the basic premise that the administration should provide evidence for its claims. Collins, regaining her composure, attempted to redirect the conversation back to the original question. She reminded Leavitt that the burden of proof lay with those making the accusations, not with journalists to disprove them. But the press secretary had successfully shifted the entire framework of the discussion. The exchange highlighted a broader strategy that the Trump administration had perfected. When faced with difficult questions about controversial claims, they would turn the tables on the questioner, challenge the legitimacy of the question itself, or demand that critics prove a negative. It was a form of political jujitsu that used the momentum of aggressive questioning against the questioner. Social media exploded almost immediately. Conservative commentators praised Leavitt for her forceful defense of the administration and her refusal to be intimidated by what they saw as hostile questioning. Liberal commentators expressed outrage at what they viewed as the administration's refusal to provide basic accountability for extraordinary claims. The clip of Leavitt's response began circulating within minutes, with the hashtag #YourAReporter trending on multiple platforms. Some saw it as a brilliant takedown of media bias, while others viewed it as an authoritarian attack on press freedom. The response had become a Rorschach test for political attitudes toward the Trump administration and the media. In the immediate aftermath of the exchange, Leavitt maintained her composure, but the impact was already spreading beyond the briefing room. News directors across the country were deciding whether to lead with the constitutional questions about Trump's pardon claims or the dramatic confrontation between their colleague and the press secretary. The moment would be remembered not just for its entertainment value, but for what it revealed about the state of American political discourse. In an era where truth and authority were constantly contested, Leavitt's response embodied a fundamental shift in how political power related to journalistic inquiry. Within hours of the press briefing, the reverberations of Leavitt's confrontation with Collins spread far beyond the White House walls. Cable news networks interrupted regular programming to analyze the exchange, while political commentators debated whether the press secretary had scored a decisive victory or damaged the administration's credibility on a fundamental constitutional issue. CNN's newsroom buzzed with activity as producers and editors grappled with how to cover a story, where their own correspondent had become the focal point. Collins herself maintained her professional composure, but colleagues could see the frustration in her eyes. She had asked a legitimate question about constitutional authority and received what amounted to a public dismissal of her professional competence. The network's response was swift and measured. Rather than escalating the confrontation, CNN chose to focus on the substantive issues raised by Trump's pardon claims. Legal analysts were brought in to explain why the president's authority to void his predecessor's pardons was constitutionally questionable at best. The strategy was clear. Let the facts speak for themselves while avoiding a personality-driven conflict with Leavitt. Meanwhile, Fox News and other conservative outlets seized on the exchange as evidence of Leavitt's effectiveness against what they portrayed as a biased media establishment. The narrative quickly emerged that the young press secretary had exposed the hypocrisy of journalists who demanded answers from Republicans while failing to investigate Democratic claims with equal vigor. Social media became a battlefield of competing interpretations. Trump supporters shared clips of the exchange with captions celebrating Leavitt's refusal to be intimidated by what they saw as hostile questioning. Critics of the administration expressed concern about the erosion of basic norms around government, accountability, and press freedom. The constitutional scholars who had been quietly analyzing Trump's pardon claims suddenly found themselves thrust into the spotlight. Law professors from prestigious universities appeared on news programs to explain the historical precedents around presidential pardons and the legal impossibility of one president simply voiding another's constitutional actions. Professor Jonathan Turley of George Washington University noted that while auto pens had been used by presidents for decades, the method of signing didn't affect the legal validity of presidential actions. The suggestion that auto pen signatures somehow invalidate presidential pardons has no basis in constitutional law, he explained to a national television audience. But the legal analysis was quickly overshadowed by the political theater. The exchange between Leavitt and Collins had tapped into deeper frustrations on both sides of the political divide about media coverage, government accountability, and the role of truth in public discourse. Behind the scenes at the White House administration, officials were divided on whether Leavitt's aggressive approach was helpful or harmful. Some praised her for refusing to be cornered by what they saw as unfair questioning, while others worried that the confrontational style was distracting from the administration's policy agenda. Trump himself seemed delighted by the coverage. He shared multiple posts on Truth Social praising Leavitt's performance and suggesting that more administration officials should follow her example in dealing with what he called the fake news media. The president's approval gave Leavitt cover for her confrontational approach and signaled that similar exchanges were likely to continue. The incident also highlighted the unique position that Leavitt occupied as the youngest press secretary in history. At just 27, she had grown up in an era where social media battles and viral moments often mattered more than traditional measures of political success. Her willingness to engage in direct confrontation reflected a generational shift in how political communication operated. Congressional Democrats seized on the exchange as evidence of the administration's disregard for constitutional norms and government accountability. They called for formal investigations into Trump's claims about the Biden pardons and demanded that the White House provide evidence for its accusations against the former president's staff. Republicans, meanwhile, rallied to Leavitt's defense, praising her for what they saw as finally holding the media accountable for their own reporting standards. They argued that journalists had become too comfortable demanding answers while failing to do the investigative work necessary to provide context for their questions. The Heritage Foundation, whose earlier post about auto pen control had helped fuel the controversy, issued a statement supporting Trump's claims and calling for a formal investigation into Biden's use of the auto pen during his final days in office. The conservative think tank's endorsement gave additional credibility to the administration's position among its supporters. As the day progressed, it became clear that the exchange had fundamentally shifted the dynamic between the White House, press corps, and the administration. Future briefings would be conducted with the knowledge that aggressive questioning might be met with equally aggressive pushback, fundamentally altering the traditional relationship between government and press. As Tuesday morning dawned, the implications of Trump's pardon claims and Leavitt's aggressive defense began to crystallize into a genuine constitutional crisis. Legal experts across the political spectrum expressed alarm at the precedent being set, while administration officials worked frantically to provide some form of legal justification for the president's extraordinary assertions. The Department of Justice found itself in an impossible position. Career attorneys knew that Trump's claim to void Biden's pardons had no constitutional foundation, but they also understood the political pressure to support the president's position. Internal memos circulated discussing potential investigations into the auto pen usage, though most legal experts viewed this as a desperate attempt to find legitimacy for an illegitimate claim. Fox News correspondent Peter Doocy arrived at the Tuesday press briefing armed with physical copies of Biden's pardons, creating a dramatic visual element that would define the day's coverage. As he held up the documents, pointing to what he characterized as very neat signatures that appeared to be machine-generated, the constitutional debate took on a tangible quality that television audiences could see and understand. Leavitt seized on Doocy's presentation as vindication of the administration's position. She invited him to bring the documents to her office for closer examination, a move that provided great television while simultaneously avoiding direct answers about the legal validity of Trump's claims. The press secretary's theatrical response demonstrated her growing confidence in using the briefing room as a stage for political theater. The revelation that former interim U.S. Attorney Ed Martin would lead an independent review into whether unelected staffers had acted as a proxy president added an official veneer to the investigation. Martin's announcement that morning gave Leavitt ammunition to suggest that legitimate legal authorities were taking Trump's concerns seriously, even as constitutional scholars continued to express skepticism. Behind the scenes, Liz Cheney and other January 6th committee members were consulting with their attorneys about the potential implications of Trump's claims. While legal experts assured them that the pardons remained valid regardless of how they were signed, the political uncertainty created by the controversy was precisely what Trump had intended. The auto pen issue highlighted a broader vulnerability in modern presidential operations. Every recent president had used automated signing devices for routine documents, from military commissions to federal appointments. If Trump's logic about auto pen signatures was accepted, it could potentially invalidate thousands of presidential actions across multiple administrations. Democratic leadership in Congress demanded a formal briefing from the White House counsel's office about the legal basis for Trump's claims. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer called the situation an unprecedented attack on constitutional governance, while House Speaker Mike Johnson attempted to downplay the controversy as a legitimate question about presidential awareness. The international implications began to emerge as foreign policy experts noted that presidential pardons often had diplomatic ramifications. If Trump could simply declare previous pardons void, it could potentially affect international agreements and relationships that had been built on the assumption of American governmental continuity. Collins and CNN faced their own internal discussions. about how to cover an administration that seemed to operate by entirely different rules than previous White Houses. The network's legal team advised reporters to continue asking substantive questions while avoiding personal confrontations that could be used to discredit their reporting. The incident had also exposed deep divisions within the Republican Party. Traditional conservatives who valued constitutional norms found themselves uncomfortable defending Trump's claims, while Trump loyalists viewed any criticism as betrayal of the president's agenda. The fault lines that had existed since Trump's first presidency were becoming more pronounced. Legal scholars began publishing detailed analyses of presidential pardon power, tracing its origins to English common law and its implementation in American constitutional practice. The unanimous conclusion was that Trump's claims were constitutionally baseless, but the political reality was that millions of Americans were hearing these scholarly opinions filtered through partisan media sources. The White House communications team, meanwhile, was working overtime to manage the fallout from what many considered a self-inflicted crisis. Internal polling showed that while Trump's base remained supportive, independent voters were increasingly concerned about the administration's respect for constitutional norms and governmental institutions. Leavitt's confrontational style, while effective in generating favorable coverage from conservative media, had also energized Democratic opposition and concerned moderate Republicans who worried about the long-term implications of such aggressive challenges to traditional governmental processes. As Tuesday evening approached, it became clear that the controversy had evolved beyond a simple dispute over presidential authority into a fundamental test of American constitutional governance and the role of truth in political discourse. In the weeks following the explosive confrontation, the reverberations of Leavitt's "You're a reporter, you should find out" response continued to reshape the landscape of American political communication. What had begun as a simple question about constitutional authority had evolved into a defining moment that would influence press-government relations for years to come. The immediate political fallout was mixed but significant. Trump's approval ratings showed a slight uptick among his base, who viewed Leavitt's aggressive defense as evidence that the administration was finally fighting back against what they perceived as media bias. However, polling among independent voters revealed growing concern about the administration's respect for constitutional norms and governmental accountability. Collins, to her credit, refused to be intimidated by the confrontation. She continued to ask tough questions at subsequent briefings, though the dynamic had fundamentally changed. Other reporters watched carefully to see how Leavitt would respond to aggressive questioning, creating an atmosphere of tension that pervaded every interaction between the press and the administration. The legal investigation promised by Ed Martin eventually concluded that while Biden had indeed used an autopen for many documents, including some pardons, there was no evidence that he was unaware of what he was signing or that his staff had acted without his authorization. The report noted that autopen usage was standard practice across multiple administrations and did not affect the legal validity of presidential actions. Constitutional law experts continued to express alarm at the precedent set by Trump's claims. A group of legal scholars from across the political spectrum published an open letter warning that accepting the logic behind Trump's pardon challenges could undermine the stability of American governmental institutions and create chaos in the transfer of power between administrations. The Heritage Foundation, which had helped fuel the initial controversy, quietly distanced itself from the more extreme claims about autopen invalidity. Internal documents later revealed that the organization's legal team had advised against pushing the constitutional arguments too far, recognizing their lack of legal foundation. Leavitt's confrontational style became a model for other administration officials dealing with hostile media coverage. Cabinet secretaries and department heads began adopting similar tactics, turning questions back on reporters and challenging the premises of critical coverage. The approach proved popular with Trump's supporters, but further eroded traditional norms of government press relations. The incident also highlighted generational differences in political communication. Leavitt's social media-savvy approach, her willingness to create viral moments, and her comfort with confrontational rhetoric reflected broader changes in how political messaging operated in the digital age. Traditional diplomatic language and careful parsing of words had given way to direct, often provocative communication designed to generate engagement and support among specific audiences. CNN and other major news organizations adapted their coverage strategies in response to the new dynamic. Editorial boards issued guidelines encouraging reporters to remain professional while continuing to ask tough questions, but also warning against allowing themselves to become the story rather than covering the story. The broader implications for democratic governance remained a subject of intense debate among political scientists and constitutional scholars. Some argued that Leavitt's approach represented a healthy challenge to media assumptions and biases, while others worried that it marked a dangerous erosion of accountability mechanisms essential to democratic oversight. The specific claims about Biden's pardons gradually faded from public attention, but the precedent set by the confrontation continued to influence political discourse. Future administrations, both Republican and Democratic, would have to grapple with the new normal established by Leavitt's aggressive defense and Trump's willingness to challenge fundamental assumptions about presidential power and constitutional processes. Looking back, historians would likely mark the exchange as a turning point in the relationship between government and press, representing both the breakdown of traditional norms and the emergence of new forms of political communication adapted to an era of deep polarization and competing narratives about truth and authority. The individual careers of both women continued to flourish in their respective spheres. Collins maintained her position as one of the country's most prominent political journalists, while Leavitt's star rose within conservative political circles as someone willing to fight aggressively for the administration's agenda. Their brief but memorable confrontation had become a defining moment for both, illustrating the personal stakes involved when individual journalists and government officials become symbols of broader political conflicts. The lasting legacy of that Monday afternoon confrontation was not just the memorable exchange itself, but the way it crystallized the fundamental tensions of American democracy in an era when basic assumptions about truth, authority, and accountability were constantly being challenged and redefined. In 5 simple words, Leavitt had captured the essence of a political moment where traditional relationships between power and oversight were being rewritten in real time.